I just want to start this blog on digital identity by saying that I actually don't have much of one. I don't really have any type of social media account. Or to be more correct, there is an account that my wife and I created because we were badgered by the Greyhound Rescue Group we work with to create a Facebook account. So instead, we just created that for our older dog, but we really don't use it. So the extent of my digital identity is restricted, say, to my email self and my pseudo persona in an NFL pool where I am use the name Dude, but that's really just an homage to a different Jeffrey Lebowski, who was the Dude. So in a nutshell, I'm essentially both me in the real world and the digital world. But to have this discussion, if we step back from this, if one so desires, their digital identity could be, say, as mundane as mine, or uh, or as extreme, say, as another personality or multiple personalities. Essentially converting oneself into an actor upon the global stage. The restriction to this is to what extent one is connected to those who know that real world persona, and the limits those real world relationships essentially impose upon the actor. From my position of digital identity abstinence, if you'll call it that, I found the insight of Foucault quite interesting. While not having seen the internet, his works directly relate to what we are seeing. So myself, having seen the transition, let's call it pre-internet to the current state or post-internet introduction, I would argue that technology is just a broader vehicle for the existing dance we do with our personality, depending on the social context we're in. Technology just allows this difference to be amplified. So, as an example, I act differently around, say, the president of the company I work for compared to how I act around my peers. And if I take this further, I act differently around my friends and family than I do around the previous two groups. But as Dawasar points out in her TED Talk, the interactions I just described take place in the present. However, in the online world, while the interactions give the illusion of being in the present, they are not. Being removed from the present provides me or this actor with an audience that I can focus on for a specific dimension of my identity, essentially in the online world. The social contact text to an extent is removed. I would argue that technology, by removing the immediacy of the interaction, shapes and influences identity, not by overt governance, but exactly the opposite, by that freedom. By removing the barriers and the immediacy of connections with others, as Sherry Turkle speaks about, it gives the feeling of anonymity whereby one can, quote unquote, experiment with one's identity. This is also found in the article from Monahan, where it explains that surveillance doesn't impact prevention of crime, it only aids apprehension of the perpetrators. And not that I'm saying anyone's online persona is criminal. I could take this further by examining this video blog itself. If I were continually blogging and not looking for any feedback, technology would be allowing me to shape my identity without the guardrails of interaction that are present in the real world. But if we're interested in the social context of my digital identity, then both technology and my real world connections would shape this online identity. If my online relationships are also a part of my real life relationships, then my online identity must be rather congruent with my real world self, else I truly appear to be performing when viewed by those who, quote unquote, know me. On the other hand, if my online identity is geared toward my online only relationships, well, then I have greater leeway in the direction I take with my identity. J.L. Austin spoke to this, that an act of sharing is a performance. Continuing with this, I would argue that both the real world self and the online identity are essentially both performances. As I've stated previously, even in the real world, we act differently depending on the audience, and the digital world is no different. My belief is that the level of performance is directly related to the reason for sharing. As Rayner points out, not everyone is in this for self-affirmation or self-creation in the digital world. Some people are just sharing for truly altruistic purposes. Ornstein saw the effects of this in the separation of her professional and private self. The anxiety she faced was based on the judgment of that distant, disconnected crowd. For the majority of us, knowing that we're not only appearing in public, but who exactly that public is has an effect on our behavior. And this is the basis for the panopticon effect. We exhibit self-control and act within prescribed social norms because we are being observed. But for the panopticon to be effective, one must care about the implications of bad behavior. So if one does not, then the panopticon doesn't work. And if the goal of one's online persona is strictly recognition, then online recognition can foster decidedly negative behavior. If the currency of online favorability is passing the material on to others, the one component lacking is that this currency doesn't necessarily make judgment about right and wrong. And I have an excellent example of this from just this past week. A colleague of mine had actually sent me a video of someone who was actually picking puppies up out of a bucket and throwing them in a river. So the intent of a colleague sharing this with me was to, help identify the perpetrators. But obviously, the perpetrators are looking for some type of recognition, or they wouldn't have, filmed these actions in the first place. And if we continue with this train of thought, were these people like this before? I would argue there was, at least a hint of this somehow to even decide to do this. Or is their digital identity exerting control over their real self and influencing them to do this? Ornstein spoke of this when she said she gave her tweeps the Peggy Ornstein they wanted. And Turkle also refers to this when she says that, I quote, "So those moments in which you're supposed to be showing your true self become a performance. Your psychology becomes a performance. But is a performance a reflection of self?" And I go back to Foucault's view of him saying the self is not given. As I said earlier, we change ourselves based on the context of the audience. So an online identity can amplify both good and bad in us. And that's where we need to have a complete awareness of our sense of self and the impact of all external forces.